The sensor array on the outer edge of Sarathi space had been running for 60 years without a single serious error. It was old technology by most standards, but old Sarathi technology was still very good. It sat in the dark between star systems, pointing its instruments at the slow drift of the galaxy, and every 12 hours it sent its data home in a tightly packed signal that nobody ever got excited about. On a Tuesday morning, by Earth's calendar, the array got excited. The technician who first saw the reading was a young Sarathi named Voss. He had been on duty for 4 hours and was halfway through a bowl of something warm when the alert came through. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them again. Then he put the bowl down very carefully. The way a person puts something down when they do not want to spill it, but are also not thinking about spilling it at all. The reading showed 500,000 objects. Each one was large. Each one was very large. The size of the objects and the energy they were putting out matched one thing and one thing only in the Sarathi database: capital-class warships. The kind that did not get built in groups of 5 or 10. The kind that took years and enormous amounts of money and the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers just to build one. There were 500,000 of them, sitting in the asteroid belt of the Sol system, the human system. Voss sent the reading to his supervisor. His supervisor sent it to the department head. The department head looked at it for a long time and then said that the array must be malfunctioning. He ordered a second sweep. The second sweep came back 40 minutes later. The numbers were the same. If anything, the second sweep was more precise. It broke the total down into formations, grid patterns, interlocking rows that stretched from the inner edge of the belt all the way out past the orbit of the large gas planet the humans called Jupiter. The department head did not say anything for a while. Then he picked up his communication terminal and called the Sarathi Intelligence Division directly, skipping 2 levels of normal procedure. Nobody complained about this later. The news moved fast after that. Faster than most news moved in the Galactic Council's network, which was usually slow because there were so many species involved, and they all had different ideas about urgency. This time, urgency was not a problem. Within 3 hours, representatives from 11 of the 15 Council species had received the data. Within 4 hours, 10 of those 11 had pulled their ambassadors from their regular quarters on Station Varenthis Prime and gathered them in a closed room without any human representatives present. The room was usually used for trade negotiations. It had comfortable chairs and a long table and a small window that looked out at the stars. It did not feel comfortable that morning. Councillor Vreth of the Sarathi sat at the head of the table. Vreth was large even by Sarathi standards, with dark green scales along his jaw and eyes that had seen 40 years of galactic politics without blinking very often. He was known in the council as a calm and steady figure. Other species trusted him because he did not panic. He read the data report 3 times before he spoke, which was normal for him. What was not normal was that when he finally spoke, his voice was slightly quieter than usual. He read the number aloud. 500,000. He said it in his own language first, then in the shared council tongue. It did not sound smaller in translation. Around the table, representatives from species that had been part of the galactic community for centuries were doing something they rarely did in formal settings. They were struggling to think clearly. The Dravathi delegate had already pulled up a tactical comparison chart on his personal screen and then closed it again because the numbers on it were making the situation feel worse rather than better. The Colossi elder was sitting very still, which among the Colossi was a sign of deep distress. A small species called the Marin, who were usually the most talkative in any room, were completely silent. Vreth told them what they already knew but needed to hear said out loud. The humans had built a fleet. Not a fleet in the way other species built fleets, with careful planning and public announcements and decades of visible construction. They had built it quietly, inside their own system, buried in a debris field and screened by commercial shipping traffic, and nobody had noticed. The Sarathi array had only caught it because the ships had apparently all run a synchronized systems check that morning, and the combined energy output had been too large to miss. The session was closed to human delegates. Ambassador Dale Harmon, who represented Earth and the United Earth Directorate on the Council, and found out about the session the way most people find out about things that are happening without them, from someone who was not supposed to tell him. In this case, it was a maintenance droid in the corridor outside the closed chamber. The droid had not told him anything directly. It had simply been cleaning the floor outside a door that was supposed to be just another meeting room, and Harmon had asked it why the door had a security seal on it, and the droid had said it was not authorized to discuss ongoing emergency sessions. Harmon stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went and sat on a bench near the station's observation deck and ate a sandwich he had been carrying in his jacket pocket since breakfast. He did not know yet what was happening inside that room. He knew something was happening. In 20 years of diplomatic work, he had learned that when you are the only person not invited to a meeting, you are usually the topic of the meeting. On Earth, Carla Owens was already 3 steps ahead of him. Owens worked in the intelligence division of the United Earth Directorate in a building dug into the side of a mountain in the American state of Colorado. She was not the most senior analyst in the building, but she was the one people called when something did not make sense. 14 months earlier, she had flagged a series of unusual power readings coming from the Mars shipyards. The readings had been explained away as interference from solar activity. She had written a note in her file saying she was not fully satisfied with that explanation, and then she had moved on because that was what the job required. Oh, she was not moving on now. A contact in the Sarathi intelligence network had forwarded her the sensor data 6 hours after Voss had first seen it. She stood in the operations center and looked at the numbers on her screen and felt very clearly that the power readings from 14 months ago had not been solar interference. She called Admiral Leon Graves. Graves was the head of Earth Fleet Command, a large and serious man who had spent his career planning for threats that most people preferred not to think about. He was on a golf course on the Carolina coast when she reached him. He listened to what she said without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her to send the data to his personal terminal. Then he told her he would call her back in 10 minutes. He called back in 6. He said he was heading to the command center, and he said she should meet him there. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say yet. Both of them knew that the next few hours were going to be very long, and that the world they had woken up in that morning was not quite the same world they were standing in now. In the asteroid belt, the ships sat in their formations. They did not move. They did not need to. They were already exactly where they needed to be. The briefing room on the 14th floor of the United Earth Directorate building in Geneva had a long glass table, 12 chairs, and a very good view of the lake. Secretary General Nina Holloway had sat in this room for hundreds of meetings. Budget reviews, border disputes, trade talks that lasted 3 days and ended with everyone angry. She had never once walked into this room and felt nervous. She felt nervous now. Admiral Leon Graves was already seated when she arrived, his big hands flat on the table, a data tablet in front of him. Across from him sat Dr. Patrice Amos, the Directorate's chief science advisor, a small and precise woman who wore the same expression whether she was explaining a breakthrough or delivering very bad news. Holloway had learned over the years that with Amos, the expression itself told you nothing. You had to listen to the words. The briefing took 3 hours. Holloway did not interrupt often. She was a person who believed that if you were going to understand something properly, you had to let it be explained all the way through before you started asking questions. She sat with her hands folded and listened as Graves walked her through the Deep Infrastructure Reserve Initiative, and a program that had been approved across 11 different Senate subcommittees over a period of 6 years, with each committee seeing only its own portion of the budget and none of them ever reading the full scope of what they were collectively approving. The ships were real. They were fully built. They were fully armed. Their systems had been tested in rolling cycles so that no single large test would appear on any external sensor sweep. The crews were drawn from reserve pools and could be fully staged within 72 hours of an activation order. The fleet's total firepower, Amos explained in a voice that remained steady throughout, exceeded the combined military capacity of the next 4 largest galactic powers. Holloway looked at that number for a long time. "Combined," she said. "Combined," Amos confirmed. There was a silence. But outside, the lake was very still and blue and completely indifferent to what was being discussed 14 floors above it. Graves explained the original logic. The fleet had been designed as a deterrent. The idea was simple. If a threat ever arose that Earth could not handle with its existing forces, the reserve fleet would be revealed and the threat would most likely reconsider. It was never meant to be an attacking force. It was meant to be a fact, a large, undeniable, impossible-to-ignore fact that any potential enemy would have to take into account before making a decision they could not undo. He described this the way an engineer describes a bridge that has been built exactly to specification, with quiet satisfaction, with no drama. Holloway asked who had known about it. Graves gave her a list of names. The list was shorter than she expected. She asked why she had not been on it. Graves said respectfully that the program had predated her tenure and that the previous Secretary General had decided the fewer people who knew, the less chance of an accidental leak. Holloway accepted this without saying what she thought of it, which was a skill she had developed over many years in public service. The Senate hearing the next morning did not go quietly. Senator Craig Dunbar, who chaired the Armed Services Committee and who had, it turned out, approved one of the 11 budget portions without understanding what it was connected to, was furious. Not about the fleet. About the secrecy. He stood up in the chamber and said that the people of Earth had a right to know their government had constructed the largest military force in the known galaxy. Several other senators agreed loudly. Several others argued just as loudly that announcing the fleet now, before any diplomatic framework was in place, would be the most dangerous thing Earth had ever done. The debate went on for 4 hours and produced no resolution, which Holloway had expected. She watched from the gallery and thought about timing. The detail that caused the most trouble, when it leaked, and it leaked within 48 hours because things always leaked, was not the number of ships. It was the cost. Amos had included in her briefing materials a line that calculated the fleet's annual maintenance cost as a percentage of Earth's total economic output. The number was 0.3%, not 3%, not 30%, 0.3. Less than 1% of what the entire planet produced in a year was enough to keep 500,000 dreadnoughts operational. When that number reached the Galactic Council, Councillor Mrith of the Kelosi, who had presided over the council for 40 years and who was not a person given to strong public reactions, stood up in the middle of a session and asked for the number to be read back to her. It was read back. She sat down. She did not speak again for the rest of that session, which was, for Misrith, something that had never happened before. On Station Varanthus Prime, Ambassador Dale Harmon had finally been granted an emergency audience with the full council. But he walked into the grand chamber and looked out at 37 alien faces looking back at him, and he understood immediately that the situation had moved well past any diplomatic script he had prepared. He had spent 20 years reading rooms. This room was telling him something very clear. It was telling him that every species in it had recently done a calculation, and the calculation had not come out in a way they found comfortable. He took his seat. He kept his face neutral, which was something he was very good at. His deputy, Yolanda Price, sat beside him and passed him a small handwritten note that said simply, "They know the 0.3% number." Harmon looked at the note. He folded it once and put it in his pocket. After the session, Vreth asked to meet him privately. They sat in a small side room off the main corridor, two people who had worked together long enough to mostly trust each other. and Vreth asked the question directly. He asked Harmon whether humanity was planning a conquest. Harmon said no. Vreth looked at him for a moment. "Then why," he said slowly, "did you build this?" Harmon thought about several answers. He settled on the honest one. "I'm going to find out," he said. Vreth studied him. The counselor had a very good sense for when humans were lying. Harmon was not lying. That, Vreth thought, was either very reassuring or a different kind of problem entirely. A species that built 500,000 warships and genuinely did not have a clear answer for why was not a species you could predict. And a species you could not predict was the one thing in 40 years of galactic politics, that Vreth had never learned to deal with comfortably. He thanked Harmon for his time. Harmon thanked him back. They walked out of the room in opposite directions. Back in Colorado, Owens was building a timeline on a wall-sized display, tracking every construction event she could find evidence of over the past 4 years. The more she filled in, the clearer it became that the entire operation had been hiding in plain sight. The power draws, the material shipments, the personnel rotations, all of it visible in the data if you were looking for it. No one had been looking for it because no one had imagined there was anything to look for. She put a small note at the bottom of the timeline. It said, "We hid this from ourselves." She stared at it for a while. Then she left it there because it was true. And true things belonged on the record even when they were uncomfortable. The Grand Tribunal of the Galactic Council had been convened 4 times in its 400-year history. Twice for war crimes, once for a planetary environmental collapse that one species had caused on another species' homeworld, and once for a trade dispute so complicated and so bitter that it had taken the tribunal 6 years to resolve, and neither side had ever really forgiven the other. The hearing for humanity was the 5th. It was officially called a clarification hearing. Every species in the building understood that this was a polite word for something much more serious. Ambassador Dale Harmon and Deputy Ambassador Yolanda Price arrived at Station Varanthus Prime aboard a standard diplomatic shuttle. No escort, no warships holding position nearby, no show of any kind. This detail was noted immediately by every intelligence observer and diplomatic analyst in the station, and it was interpreted in approximately 14 different ways by 14 different species. Some thought it showed confidence, some thought it showed stupidity. The Colossi elder thought it showed something she did not have a word for in her own language, which she found unsettling in a different way from everything else. Price had spent the transit time doing what she always did before a difficult hearing, building the other side's argument so she could find the holes in it. She was a former trade lawyer from Atlanta, sharp and fast, and not especially patient with people who confused volume for logic. She handed Harmon her notes when they docked. He read them on the walkway into the station. He handed them back without comment. She took this to mean he agreed with her assessment. The tribunal hall was the largest room on the station. It could seat 400 observers in addition to the council members and their delegations. It was full. Species that had not sent observers to any council event in years had sent observers to this one. Harmon counted roughly 30 different species in the gallery as he walked to the human delegation's table. He kept his face neutral and his walk steady and thought about nothing except the next step in front of him. Treth of the Dravathi opened the proceedings. He was a tall and angular figure, gray-skinned with deep-set eyes that gave nothing away. He had built his entire career on making other parties feel like they were in the wrong before the argument had even begun, and he was very good at it. His opening address lasted 90 minutes. It was detailed, carefully sourced, and logically structured. It traced every human military expansion over the past century. It noted every shipyard construction project, every weapons development program, every defense budget increase. It laid these facts out in order and let them build toward a single conclusion. The fleet was not a surprise. It was the destination of a journey that had been going on for a very long time. and the only surprise was that no one had seen it coming. Harmon listened to all of it without taking a single note. Price took many notes. She filled 3 pages with small, precise handwriting. At the end of Treth's address, she leaned over to Harmon and said quietly that about 60% of what Treth had said was factually accurate. Harmon nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. When it was his turn, Harmon stood up and did not look at his notes either. He did not argue with the facts Treth had presented. He said that the facts were largely correct. He said that humanity had built up its military capacity over a long period of time, steadily and deliberately, and that this was true. What he wanted to talk about, he said, was why. He told them about the early years, the years before humanity had reached the stars, when the planet was small and the universe was enormous and completely unknown. He talked about the specific feeling of being a species that knows it is not alone but does not yet know what that means. He said that feeling had a particular quality to it. It was not the same as ordinary fear. It was quieter than that. It sat at the back of everything you did and everything you built and every decision you made, and it never fully went away. He looked around the room. He said that he suspected many of the species present knew that feeling, that most of them had been, at one point or another, the smaller party, the less powerful one, the one that could not defend itself as well as it would have liked. He said that if that was true for them, they already understood the basic human situation, because humans had felt that way for a long time and had decided, not as a government policy but as something closer to a deep collective instinct, that they were not going to feel that way forever. The room was very quiet. Harmon kept going. He said the fleet was not a weapon pointed at anyone. It was an answer to a question that had been sitting inside the human species for generations. The question was, what do we do if something comes for us and we have nothing to fight back with? The fleet was the answer. It was built not to attack, but to make the question feel less frightening. He said he understood that this did not make it less alarming to look at from the outside. He was not asking them to find it comforting. He was asking them to understand it correctly. Then he did something that Secretary General Holloway had not authorized him to do. He made an offer. He said the fleet was available, not as a human tool, as a shared one. He said that if the Council wanted to talk about a collective security arrangement, a framework in which human military capacity was placed, at least partially, and under a joint command structure, Earth was willing to have that conversation. Price did not react visibly. She had learned long ago not to react visibly when Harmon went off the prepared text, because it happened often enough that reacting to it would become exhausting. She made a small note at the bottom of her page. Mirith called a recess 30 minutes after Harmon finished speaking. During the recess, 6 different delegations requested private meetings with the human team. Price scheduled them all. When she showed Harmon the list, he looked at it and said nothing, which she took as a sign that he was pleased. Treth found Harmon in the corridor near the water dispensers. He came alone, which was unusual for Treth, who usually moved with at least 2 aides. He stood in front of Harmon and looked at him for a moment. "The offer," Treth said. "Is it genuine?" "Yes," Harmon said. Treth said nothing else. He turned and walked back down the corridor at a measured pace. Harmon watched him go. Price appeared at his shoulder a moment later and said she thought that was probably the best outcome they could have hoped for from Treth. Harmon agreed. A person who asked if something was genuine and then walked away without arguing was a person who was thinking seriously about it. Treth thinking seriously about something was a significant development. It meant the ground was shifting, slowly, in the direction of something that might eventually be workable. On the secure uplink feed in Colorado, Owens had watched the entire session. She had said nothing during Harmon's speech. When it ended, she sat for a moment and then typed a short message to Graves. He went off script. Graves replied 4 minutes later with 2 words. Good speech. The Drivathi battle group entered the Outer Sol system at 0340 hours by Earth fleet time. 62 vessels, not small ones. They came in slow and spread out, which was the way a sensor sweep worked when you wanted good coverage, without looking like an attack formation. They filed their flight path as a navigational correction, which was a standard piece of paperwork that border monitoring stations processed automatically without any human eyes touching it. It was, by every official measure, a routine transit. It was not a routine transit. Admiral Leon Graves was notified 4 minutes after the Dreadnoughts group crossed the boundary marker. He was at his desk at Lunar Station Alpha, eating a late dinner and reading a maintenance report that he had been trying to get through for 3 days. The notification came in on his command channel, the one that only rang for things that actually mattered. He read the alert. He put his fork down. He looked at the tactical display that filled the left wall of his office, showing the Dreadnoughts vessels as small amber dots moving slowly through the outer system. His operations officer was already on the line asking for instructions. The standard response to an unannounced military incursion into sovereign space was to go to alert status, lock targeting systems, and issue a formal warning. It was the correct response by every procedure Graves had ever been trained on. Every protocol said do it. Every instinct from 30 years of military service said do it. Graves looked at the amber dots. He thought for a moment. Then he gave a different order. He told his operations officer to send one signal to the fleet grid in the asteroid belt. The signal was simple. It told every dreadnought in the outer formations to activate its running lights. Nothing else. No weapons activation, no targeting locks, no change in formation, no communication to the Dreadnoughts vessels at all, just lights. The operations officer repeated the order back to make sure he had heard it correctly. Graves confirmed it. The officer sent the signal. Captain Sandra Elliott was on the bridge of the Dreadnought Resolute Cause when the order came through. The Resolute Cause sat near the front edge of the outer grid, one of the first ships in the formation that the Dreadnoughts sweep would reach if it kept going. Now, Elliott was a lean woman in her 40s who had been commanding capital ships for 12 years and who had developed the particular kind of calm that came not from never being afraid, but from being afraid often enough that it no longer interfered with your thinking. She read the order. She read it again. Then she said quietly to her bridge crew, "Running lights, all of them." It took 11 minutes for the activation signal to propagate from one end of the grid to the other. 11 minutes for 500,000 ships to turn on their lights, one wave after another, moving outward from the inner belt to the outer formations in a slow, steady pulse. The Dreadnoughts sensor officers saw it happen in real time on their displays. They watched the darkness of the asteroid belt fill with light. Not weapon discharges, not drive signatures. Just lights. The kind you turned on to say, "We are here. We can see you. We are watching you, and we are not doing anything except watching you." The lead Dreadnoughts vessel stopped moving. This was noted immediately on Elliott's secondary display. She watched the dot on her screen go from slow drift to full stop in about 40 seconds. The other 61 vessels in the group adjusted to match, clustering loosely behind the lead ship the way smaller animals cluster behind the largest one when something unexpected happens. The lead vessel sent a signal, standard hailing frequency, the most ordinary and non-specific communication in the Interstellar Handbook. It was the frequency you use to say hello, or to ask for route clearance, or to check that your communications array was working. It meant nothing specific and everything general. The Elliott looked at it. She composed a response. She sent back a navigation corridor clearance acknowledgement, a piece of automated-sounding paperwork that said essentially that the Dreadnoughts vessels were noted and their transit lane was clear. It was the most boring possible response to an illegal military incursion into sovereign space. It was also, Elliott understood, exactly right. It said, "We see you. We know what you are doing. And we are so completely unbothered by it that we are responding with routine transit paperwork." The Dreadnoughts group did not move for nearly 2 hours. Elliott's bridge crew did not say much during those 2 hours. They watched their displays. Someone brought coffee. Someone else, in the back of the bridge near the secondary system station, started clapping slowly at one point. 3 quiet claps. Not the kind that start building and then stop themselves because the person doing it realizes the moment is too big for that. The clapping stopped after 3. Nobody said anything about it. It felt somehow like exactly the right amount of applause for the situation. The Dreadnoughts group began withdrawing at 06:12 hours. Slowly, in good order, back the way they had come. They were fully outside the boundary marker by 08:31. Graves watched their drive signatures fade off the tactical display and then sat back in his chair and finished his dinner, which was cold. Owens and her team intercepted the Dreadnoughts internal communications the following morning. The intercept team was good at their work and the Dreadnoughts encryption, while solid, it was not designed to hold against the kind of sustained attention that Earth intelligence was currently giving to everything Dreadnoughts. The messages were from 4 different officers on 4 different vessels, written separately, filed as individual incident reports. They used different words and different formats. They all said the same thing. The phrase translated as closely as Owens's translation software could manage as, "We did not understand the scale." She read it several times. Then she forwarded the intercept to Graves, to Harmon, and to Holloway in a single message with no subject line and no additional text. She felt that the phrase spoke well enough for itself. Holloway read it at her desk in Geneva at 7 in the morning. She sat with it for a while. Then she pulled up Harmon's file. I found the entry where his unauthorized offer to the council had been flagged as a procedural breach and added a single line to it. Offer retroactively authorized. She thought for a moment and then added a second line below it. Next time, ask first. Treth learned about the Dreadnoughts incursion through his own channels, independently of the council. He sent a private message to the hardline faction within the Dreadnoughts state, distancing himself from what had happened. The message was careful and measured and said nothing overtly critical. It did not need to. The fact that he had sent it at all, in the hours immediately after the withdrawal, was the political statement. It was the kind of message that closed a door quietly instead of slamming it. People who paid attention to these things noticed. Several of them updated their assessments of where the Dreadnoughts political situation was heading, and most of those updated assessments pointed in the same general direction. In the asteroid belt, the running lights were still on. No one had given the order to turn them off. Graves had not thought to include that in the original instruction, and nobody had asked. The ships sat in their formations in the dark, lit up from one end of the grid to the other, patient and enormous and perfectly still. It looked from a distance like a second field of stars had appeared inside the solar system overnight. A field that had always been there, a field that was now simply visible. The Collective Security Framework Treaty was signed on a Thursday, 1 year and 9 days after the Sarathi sensor array had first picked up the fleet. The signing took place in the middle gallery of Station Varanthus Prime, in a room with tall windows that looked out at open space. 9 of the 15 council species put their marks on the document. That was more than anyone had predicted 2 months earlier, and fewer than Harmon had hoped for, and about what Price had told him to realistically expect, which meant Price had, as usual, read the situation most accurately. The 9th signature came from a junior Dreadnoughts delegate named Arrow, a young official who had been sent in place of any senior figure, which allowed the Dreadnoughts government to be part of the treaty without any of its prominent names being publicly attached to it. It was a careful, cautious move. Harmon understood it and respected it. You took the signature you could get. The politics could catch up later. And Harmon signed for Earth last. He used a pen he had been carrying since his first diplomatic posting, a cheap ballpoint from a drugstore in Cleveland, with a small smear of dried ink on the cap that he had never cleaned off. It had no business being present at a document of this significance. He used it anyway because it was the pen he had in his pocket, and because there was something fitting about a treaty that changed the shape of the galaxy being signed with something so ordinary. The terms of the treaty were human in character, which meant they were enormous and logistically complicated and somehow still optimistic. 480,000 dreadnoughts would remain in the asteroid belt reserve. 200 would be assigned immediately to joint patrol routes, crewed by mixed human and council species teams. 20,000 would be placed on rotating secondment, offered to member species for crew exchange and training programs. The numbers had taken 6 weeks of negotiation to arrive at, and nobody was completely happy with them, which Harmon had told Holloway was a reliable sign that they were probably fair. Graves attended the signing ceremony via secure uplink from Lunar Station Alpha. His face was on a large screen at the back of the room, slightly pixelated because the connection was not perfect. Price noticed that he was smiling. She had seen Graves at many events over the past year and had not once seen him smile. She mentioned this to Harmon afterward. Harmon said he had noticed too. Yolanda Price was offered the role of Earth's permanent representative to the Joint Defense Council that the treaty created. She accepted it on one condition. She said she wanted someone to explain to her before she started what was wrong with the last 12,000 dreadnoughts that still did not have their navigational arrays installed. This question went to Graves, who went to his logistics division, who spent 3 days researching it before sending back a report explaining that the arrays had been on order from a supplier on Mars for 14 months, and the delivery had been held up by a paperwork error involving the wrong customs code. Price read the report and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said she would start in 2 weeks. Owens published her internal debrief the week after the signing. She titled it simply, "What We Missed and Why." It was 40 pages long, detailed, and written in the direct and slightly uncomfortable style that Owens brought to everything she wrote. It traced every moment in the previous 4 years when the fleet could have been detected by an outside intelligence service, every indicator that had been present but ignored, every explanation that had been accepted too quickly. It was not a comfortable read for anyone who had been part of the intelligence community during that period. It became required reading at every human intelligence agency within 6 months and stayed required reading for the next 40 years. Vreth attended the signing in person. He sat in the second row, in the observer section, watching the delegates take their turns at the document. He had spent the year becoming the closest thing to a genuine human ally on the council. It had not been a comfortable year. He had been challenged within his own delegation, questioned by the Sarathi government, and accused by 2 other species of being too accommodating toward a power that had not yet proven its intentions. He had listened to all of it without changing his position, which was that a species which chose not to use a weapon it clearly could use was a species worth talking to. He watched Harmon sign the treaty with the old pen and thought about the distinction he had been working through for most of the past 12 months. The distinction between a species that was dangerous and a species that chose not to be. It was, he had come to believe, the most important distinction in the galaxy. The first kind of species you feared and avoided. The second kind you feared, and then, slowly and carefully, learned to stand next to. The work of learning to stand next to something frightening was hard work. It was also, Vreth thought, the only kind of work that actually mattered in the long run. Treth's response to Harmon's private message of acknowledgement arrived 11 days after it was sent. It was 2 words long. The translation software rendered it as, "Well done." Harmon read it and showed it to Price. She said it was more than she had expected. Harmon said he agreed. They did not discuss it further because there was nothing more to say, and because both of them had other things to do, and because sometimes the most important things ended quietly, and that was fine. On the evening of the signing, after all the formal events were finished and the other delegations had gone back to their quarters, Harmon sat alone in the station's observation lounge. It was a small room off the main corridor with low lighting and a wide window that looked out at a stretch of open space. He had a cup of tea that had gone cold. He was not drinking it. He was just sitting with it looking at the stars. in the way that people sit with things they have been carrying for a long time and have finally been able to put down. A young Sarathi technician came into the lounge and sat down a few seats away. Harmon did not recognize him, though if he had looked more carefully he would have seen something familiar in the technician's manner. The careful, precise way he moved, the habit of checking his surroundings twice. It was Voss, the technician who had first seen the sensor reading a year ago. He had requested a transfer to Station Varanthus Prime 3 months earlier, partly out of curiosity and partly because he had spent a year thinking about what his discovery had set in motion. Voss looked at Harmon. He did not know who Harmon was. He saw an older human in a suit that did not quite fit, sitting alone in a quiet room with a cold cup of tea, looking out at space with the kind of expression that did not ask to be disturbed. He almost said nothing. Then his curiosity got the better of him, as it usually did. "Are humans always like this?" he said. Harmon looked at him. He thought about the question. It was, he understood, a genuine one. Voss was not being rude or provocative. He was asking because he actually wanted to know. Harmon had spent a year trying to explain humanity to species that found them alarming. He had used careful language and diplomatic frameworks and reasoned arguments, and he thought about all of those now, and then he set them aside. "Yes," he said. "More or less." Voss nodded slowly, the way you nod when an answer both makes sense and raises new questions. He looked out at the stars for a moment, then he got up and left the room, and Harmon went back to looking at the window. In the asteroid belt, the Dreadnoughts were dark again. The running lights had been turned off 2 weeks ago, once it became clear they had done what they needed to do. The ships sat in their formations, patient and quiet, the way they had always sat. They had not moved. They did not need to move. They were already exactly where they needed to be, and the galaxy, slowly and carefully and imperfectly, was beginning to understand that.